Hello and welcome to part 3 of the lobby matchmaking with mirror tutorial series. In the last episode, or last part, we went over creating a lobby system with matchmaking in which you get a 5-digit code and anybody can input that code and join up with that particular lobby. In this episode, we're going to automate that slightly, as I was asked on the YouTube channel, on the YouTube comments, on how to do automatic matchmaking. And so in this episode, we're going to go over clicking a search button to find a public match to simply join. Otherwise, you can also host a private match in which you would still have to put in the code. So I've updated the flow diagram over here a bit now to represent what we're going to be doing and covering in today's episode. So the UI is going to change a little bit with a search button, have a host private and a host public button as well. And pretty much we're just going to hook into the existing systems already. So if you haven't been following this series yet, then you need to go back and follow the last 2 videos that basically get the bulk of the work done for us. So this episode is about building on top of that and adding some extra functionality. So we're still only going to be working in 3 scripts predominantly, and this can basically be seen as an MVC model. If you have heard about software architecture before, you've probably heard the term MVC, which is the model, view, and controller type of approach of separating how you manage your system architecture, so that you're not mixing in user input with system processing and then back on the output. And the MVC model kind of rotates around the idea of putting in a request, that request being processed, and then giving you back the results of that request. So in our little system over here, that can kind of be broken down into, we have the matchmaker, which would be the model, so the data. All of this is the processing, the raw processing of our inputs. Then we have the view, which would be the UI, which is all of this. So you click on a button, you input some text, you press the cancel. What does that all do? So that's the UI, being the view part of that. And then the controller being handling requests would be how the UI is then interpreted through the UI lobby system here. And the UI lobby system then takes in all those inputs. It adjusts the view as well. So if it needs to show the response, then this script will take care of that. So we've got a clear separation then of we have our inputs, our processing as well, and then our outputs being shown back through the UI lobby script. Right, so if we start at the top, we start at our inputs. We have our host button in the previous episode has now been changed into a host private and host public. So that now splits into 2 separate functions there to handle the click on the UI. That then goes down into the player script once more and just carries on the exact same flow. The only difference here is that now we'll have a bool to say whether it's private or public. And in our searching algorithm, then we will first obviously check if the match is public, then allow that to be a valid result, otherwise not. Some other features that we've added in here as well are, so the search matchmaking. We have the private and public matches. We also added in disconnection handling. So if a client disconnects from a game, that needs to be represented accurately, first of all, in the lobby, but then also we need to handle that in the game as well. And how does that then impact the match data? So the match class obviously holding what is the match ID and a list of the players as well. And we also have some, so that would be the match cleanup feature, which basically just listens for any changes on the player side and then gets updated so that the match data is always accurate and we don't have any null reference exceptions in there. If the lobby also has no players, then we want the lobby to be destroyed. If we're thinking of this in terms of having a dedicated server that runs all these lobbies in one single game instance, then we definitely want some cleanup code that will get rid of any lobbies that are no longer needed. Otherwise, we're just going to be using more and more RAM, and eventually your server will probably crash because it's run out of memory. Cool. So I've gone ahead and made some UI modifications to the scene. Let me just find the right one over here. So let me just show you exactly what that is. So let's go to the lobby scene. Okay, so all that's changed. We have the exact same layout over here, apart from now we have a new searching panel over here. And if we dive down into the connect hierarchy, we have the search button now at the top, which is just a simple button that will link to the UI lobby later on. We have the join button, still does the same business, and in the host we have now taken the private or the host button, split it into two, and at the moment they're both calling the host function on UI lobby. So we want all our UI to communicate through this UI lobby script over here. We still have all our references set up correctly. So let's get started on adjusting our UI lobby to reflect our new UI. So our references over here are going to have to be adapted. So now we've got a lot more buttons, and what we're doing over here is basically making the buttons uninteractable when we click on something, because obviously a networking call is a delayed call, or the response is delayed. It doesn't happen in a single frame. So we need to make sure that we prevent any double clicking of buttons and double requests by just disabling them for a bit, and then once the result has been returned, then we just turn them back on. So to avoid this getting really cumbersome and having multiple lines for everything, we're actually going to change how we set the interactables on and off by creating a list over here. So we're going to do a serialized field, and we're going to do a list of selectables. So selectable is actually the let me just write this out. Selectables equals new list. So selectable is a class that all interactable UI elements inherit from. So we can actually just use selectable to kind of group them all up together. And you'll notice under here, under selectable, we have the bool for interactable. So all interactables inherit from the selectable class and therefore have this bool over here. So we can group them all up. Basically images, or rather buttons, input groups, input fields, any sort of interactable element, we can enable and disable it or group it all up into one list called a list of selectables. So this is going to help because then we don't need to have all these buttons here, and we can take that out then. So let's get rid of the buttons. And now our lobby selectables, we can go, and wherever we have our interactables there, we can go into lobby selectables dot, and we're going to use a for each x. So x, this is a lambda expression, so x represents each of these individual selectables, and then we're going to go x dot interactable equals false. Okay, so basically that little line just does a for each loop through each of the items and refers to each item as x, and then we just set each item to false. Okay, so that means all of that can go away. If you're not getting the for each pop-up here, then you might need to add in link as well. So using system.link, it seems to be compiling for me, which is weird, which means that it would have been that the for each is being included as part of list. Okay, cool. It's built into list directly. Great. Okay, so everywhere we've got that. Hold on, that one was true, so let's change this one to true. This one is going to be false, yes, and this one's going to be true over here. Okay, cool. Okay, so that means now we can have just a simple list of selectables there and just turn all those selectables on and off as needed. We have a lobby canvas. We're also going to need a search canvas over here so that we can turn that search UI on and off as we need. And let's see, what else do we need? I think that's it for now. And then maybe let's just go and add that in so long, add in all our references now that we've gotten rid of our buttons, because we want this button disabled, that input field disabled, that button disabled, and these two buttons disabled. So, I mean, that just prevents us from having 4 buttons referenced individually and then an input field on top of that. So we can just go and lock that, so we can go and multi-select our buttons, our input fields, and drag them all in at once on there. So you can see how a button and an input field are treated exactly the same because it's a list of selectables there. Just makes things a lot easier. Then we also need to drop in our search canvas. And if I just unlock this, I can show you what the search canvas looks like. So we're just turning that canvas on, and it's got a little searching text over there. We have a cancel button as well, because if we do want the ability to cancel out of searching for a game. And we have a little image over here which has just 3 dots. And what this does, it's actually on a fill. So basically it'll do that, that, that. So it basically just counts through them. And I've just got that hooked up with a little animator. So I can actually just preview this animation over here. So quite a nice little way of doing a little loading animation in a way. And it's just using the fill. So it sets the fill from 0 to 0.3 to 0.66 to 1, which basically kind of shows how a new dot is being introduced. Then at the middle here, we actually just switch around the fill origin from left to right, and then it basically counts down. So very cool. Thought that was nice. Okay, so that's it for our little references for now. So let's first of all turn this canvas back off and start hooking up our buttons. So let's start with the host, private, and public, since that is just a derivative of what we've already got. So we've got this host function over here. We're going to change this host function into host private, and let's duplicate that, and I'm pressing Ctrl-Shift-D in VS Code with the Sublime shortcuts pack, in case you were wondering. Sublime text key map. Much better shortcuts in my opinion. Cool. Then we're going to do a public over here as well. And it's going to do the same stuff, other than when we call host game on the player, we need now a host game with a bool for private or public there. Okay, so if we follow the rabbit hole down, we get our host game, which is happening on the local client. So let's put in a new parameter over there for a bool of, let's say, public match. And that means in our lobby now, we need to say false for the private match and true for the other one. And let's hook up those buttons real quick so we don't forget. Go into connect, go host private. So here we're going to go down, and this is going to be host private. And then over here we're going to do lobby and host public. There we go. Okay, so we've hooked our buttons up, hosting a private and a public match. Okay, so back to the player script. Now, the player script on the host game, we have a bool for that now, and we'll need to then pass that bool along to our CMD as well. So when we start a game, let's just follow that. So that just gives us the ID, and then we pass that ID along to command host game, which then calls the host game function over here. Right, so in host game on matchmaker, let's put it before over here. So bool public match, and then in our player script here, we need to, first of all, let's pass that along as a parameter. And then as our third parameter here, it's going to be public match. Okay, so we're just passing public match there. We need to pass it in over here as well. And then when we call host game will then interpret public match and then just flip a bool for us. So in our match data, we're going to change a few variables over here now. We just want to have, let's say, I think 3 new bools, starting with a public bool for public match. We'll also want a public bool for if the match has already begun, so in match, and this is going to then prevent players from connecting to an already existing match. And then we're also going to have one for match full, and match full so that we can't join a game that already has all the players it needs for the game. Great, so now in our host game, we need to set public match then according to this. So when we create the match, we create a new match. And a match is a class, so we can actually just put it in over here as match dot public match equals public match. Okay. So that'll just set the public match directly over there. So if we click private, it's going to be false. And if we click public match, it's going to be true. Fantastic. So now let's, that should work either way the same. All we won't be able to do is search at the moment. So let's get the search functionality going. Okay, with search, we need to create a new public void search game. And this is where the UI will feed its call into. So we can actually just hook that up before we forget. Let's go search and lobby.search game. Okay, that is now hooked up. Fantastic. And maybe let's just add a little login here for searching for game. Okay, and what we want that to do when we click search is we want to click the search button. We want to start a search coroutine, and then every n seconds, whatever you decide, we're going to then call the search game function on the player. So the reason for doing this as well is just to give other players a chance to start up a match, so that it's not a once-off search, oh, didn't find any matches, try again whenever you feel like it. We're going to repeat this action every couple seconds so that as soon as a match is available, then we can check for validity. So are there enough slots open? Is it a public match? And then we just join that. Okay. And we also need to show the search canvas. So we have our search canvas over there, and we're just going to say dot enabled equals true. And because it's last in the hierarchy, the search canvas will be displayed over everything else. So we don't have to actually turn anything off at this point. We can just enable it directly over that. Right, then we need a coroutine for actually searching or for calling that search function on the player every so often. And for that, so we're going to create a little coroutine here. So enumerator, searching for game. Okay, and let's just create a little float here for check every few seconds equals, and we're just going to make it 1. So every 1 second we're going to check that. And actually, we're not going to make that a float. We're going to make that a wait for seconds. And it's a equals new wait for seconds 1. Okay, then we're going to do a while, and now to our condition for while, we'll need a bool for searching. So let's just do a bool over here for searching and set it to false by default. Going back down, while searching, then we need to have a yield return null function, or in this case actually we're just going to do a check every few seconds. Cool. So then we need a function to actually call the search. And just for visual appearance, I'm actually going to do that first so that it does a second and then it looks. Otherwise, what's going to happen is as soon as you call search, it's going to immediately join and we're not going to be able to see that nice UI of, oh, we're searching for a game now. Just adds to the whole experience of, playing a game and going through the search and finding a game, that sort of stuff. So you probably do want to have a little bit of a 1 second wait before it actually does the call, just so it's not instant. You need some time to build these things up. Okay, so on our player we need a function for actually searching for a game, and we've got host match, join match, begin match. Let's do that in between over here, and we're going to do search match, and we're going to do a public void search, and I'm going to make a search game, sorry. Just keeping with convention here. Everything is called game, not match. So search game. And actually this is going to be a bool. Is it going to be a bool? No, we're not going to make it a bool. Because it needs to go off to the server, and then the server needs to do its business, and then the server needs to send the result back. So we're going to follow the same structure as this, where we have the local function that then calls a command function, that then calls a target function, which then calls the UI's success method over there. Okay, so let's do the same thing. This one's going to be the CMD, and let's give it the command attribute. These things won't run without these attributes on them. And a target RPC, which means we need the target prefix there. Okay, in search game, we're going to call CMD search game. In command search game, we're going to call, we're going to do a matchmaker call, same as how we've got the if matchmaker.instance.join game. We're going to do a search game. And we're probably going to have to give it the same parameters there, so I'm actually just going to copy that one and then just change the name over here, and wherever it says join, and I'm pressing here Control D to select the next one of exactly the same name. Just makes it really handy to rename things like that. And then target search game needs the same parameters here, and let's just give that exactly the same, and then instead of it being join, that's going to be search success. Okay, so our match, let's go back to our UI player lobby. We just need to set up our receiving function here. Whoops, didn't copy that clearly. And that's going to change from join to search. And that's the inputs. That is fine. Yeah, so that just sets all interactables back to true. The search success, we can actually directly call join success from over here because it's doing the exact same thing. So basically the search is just doing like an automatic join. It's just going to find a keyword so the match ID of a match that fits our parameters of being public and having space and not being in a match, and we can just join that. So we're actually just going to give it the exact same things there. The only other thing over here in our search success is we do want to cancel this out. So we do want to say searching equals false. and that'll then cancel out our while loop over here. When we do start the game, we want to go searching for game. First of all, start the coroutine, searching for game, and then once our time is set there, we're going to do player.localplayer.search game. And let's see, do we need any parameters? No, we do not. We are just simply searching for a game. And if we do find one, then it's going to set searching immediately to false. And the next time round, a second later, this should be invalidated and it would continue then, or cancel out the coroutine. It would have been complete. Okay, so on the player, where we call search game, we are not going to give it a match ID this time because we're going to be looking through all the matches to find a matching ID. And we're going to maybe output a match ID. So let's do out, and it's going to be a string, or we can just out directly to match ID instead. Once we found the game, that's it, you're in the game, so we can output directly to our match ID variable over there. And then when we want to pass that match ID through there, we're going to give it match ID, not underscore match ID in that case. We do still need to set the match ID of the network checker, and we're going to set it according to that one. The rest seems good. And okay, cool. So now we need to follow the rabbit hole once more. Go to Matchmaker. We don't have a function for search game just yet. So let's go ahead and create one. We'll create one under the join over here. And it's going to be a public bool for search game. And in our search game, we have 3 parameters here. Okay, so we need 3 parameters there. Let's put in the game object, the player index, which is an int, and then the string. So game object, and this is going to be the player. Then we need the int for the player index, and that is actually going to be an out. So out int player index, and then we're going to do another out string for match ID. Great. Okay, so we need to return something. So let's just start by returning false at the end. Then we need to, so let's just look at this over here. The search functionality, we've done this. So on the local player to the command then goes over to the matchmaker. So here we need to find a match with ID. Hold on, no, following the wrong one here. We want to find a public match that has player space, and then we want to join that match and return the, or output the match ID, and then return true or false. Okay, so we need to go through all the matches. We're just going to do a for loop, and we're going to go through matches.count. Cool, and we're going to say if matches I dot, and here we want to see, first of all, is it a public match? And we also want to check, is it not match full? So there is space. And we want to see if it is not currently in a match. Then we have a matching match, in which case we can say match ID equals matches I dot ID. So we've got our ID being output there, and now we can hook into our already existing join game. Since we have the match ID, let's say join game, and also let's say if join game, just in case, some double verification here. We're going to give it the match ID. We're going to give it the player object that we've already got there. We're going to output it to player index. So outputting it directly to this variable. And yeah, we do need the out keyword there. And if we do manage to join the game, then what we want to do is return true. And we'll do else. We don't need an else there, because then what we're going to do is if this join game does not get validated, then it's just going to go through the next for loop, find another match that matches the same parameters, and attempt to join that, in which case it would be correct. Okay, so the only other thing here is it is complaining that the player index must be set initially. So we've already done this before. We're going to copy that one, paste it over there. It just needs a default value. It needs to have something. And then over here, match ID also needs to be set. So in this case, match ID is going to equal, and we're going to do string.empty. Oh, that is right, yeah. And string.empty is just a shortcut basically to an empty string, but this doesn't create any garbage. So just as a general good rule, good practice to follow, just use string.empty instead of doing like double quotation marks. Just creates less garbage. And if you're doing this like in a for loop or something, this is definitely going to make an impact. Because obviously a string is actually just a list of chars in the back end, so it's actually a reference type and not a value type. Unlike most of the base types, like an int or a float being value types. Cool. So we search the game, we find a match that matches, we then attempt to join it. If we do, we return true, and we've already filled out our output variables over there and over there. So moving back to player, where this call took place, we can now see game searched successfully. Let's say game found and game not found. And in my previous video, this wasn't actually showing the color. The reason was that there were extra spaces between here. That doesn't compute. It needs to be no spaces. Then you can have rich text in your console, which makes it a lot easier to read, because if there's something really bright red, it catches your eye. Okay, then we search the game, we pass that match ID back, and we log out the match ID just to make sure that we are getting them matching, which obviously it will, because that is set directly there. And this was the fix in the previous video where we said, or we were having issues of sync vars not being updated immediately, where the target RPC was being called and the sync var was being updated in the same frame, and the target call was being called as a higher priority than the sync var's update. So basically we just had to give that variable directly through there as well, so that it has everything in check and we're not relying on networking packets being in order. Then we tell the UI lobby about the success. Was it a success? If it was, we call the join success, which basically just changes the UI a bit. One thing we'll need to do over here as well is just turn off that search canvas, since it was a success, or if it was a success. And we can actually just call it, set it according to that. So if it was a success, do that. And if it wasn't, then that will remain on. So let's see, if it wasn't a success here, it sets that interactable back to true and all those other ones back to true. So that we might not want to do. So let's actually wrap that in a if success, then we call join success. Just so that it prevents turning those interactables back on prematurely. And then searching is going to equal false only if it was a success. And if it was not a success, then we're just going to basically ignore it. So actually we can just set this to false directly over there. That kind of makes more sense. Basically, if it is a success, we do something, and if it's not, well, then hey, we don't. And it'll carry on doing that part there. So the next thing we also want to do is we want the ability to cancel a search, where we just basically set searching to false, and then it turns off the coroutine and sets the UI back to normal. So we're going to do a public void cancel search. We have search game. Let's do search cancel, just so it follows the same kind of naming convention. So everything with search starts with search. Okay, and if we cancel the search, we want searching to become false, in which case this will stop. We want the canvas to turn off, and we want our interactables to be validated or turned back on again. So let's just copy that line and pop that in there. So we turn those interactables back on. Okay, I think that is it. We just need to hook up our search cancel here as well to our button. So on searching, we have cancel search, and let's go search cancel. Okay, so that'll cancel the search out there. Make sure that we have all of our references set up correctly. Yes, that looks fine. Okay, let's run it. Host a private game. Okay, immediately we get an error. Where's our console? There it is. Object reference. Let's see what that is. Player to local player, host game, false. Let's see what's going on here. In our start function, we are checking that. Which basically means local player is not set at that point, which is interesting. Line 35, player to local player to host game. Oh, of course, we're running straight from the lobby scene. We need to load it from the offline scene. Then we host. Okay, hosting a private match. The game is successfully hosted. Great stuff, and we can begin the game, and it goes into the game. No errors, no problems. Cool. So now, and I don't think I explained this one last time, but I'm using a program called SyncToy. It's a Microsoft application. It's free to download. You basically just set up two folders that have the same project. So I just duplicate my Unity project, and then when you run it, it will copy everything from the one side to the other side. And that just makes testing, networking in Unity or with Mirror just so much easier, because then I can have a secondary Unity off to the side here that I can easily test the two with. So you can run this one, let's run this one, and host local server. Great, that one automatically connected because it found the local server. And I'm going to host a private game just to test. And remember, the two here is an issue because this is a host and a client at the same time, so it is showing all players regardless of their GUID. So you can see here the GUIDs don't match, but it's because it's the server. The server has to know all. Okay, so if we input that value, let's just make sure that this still works, 9F. We join the game, cool. We begin the game, great. Both players are thrown into the game scene. So we know that works. Let's run that again. Host, joins. Okay, this time we're going to host a public, and this time we're going to do the search function. So calling search, searching for game, and let's see what happened. Clearly something did not happen. So we go find search game, searching for game, while searching. waits a second, calls search game. Search game calls the CMD game here. If it does manage to search a game, we should have got the, and that does match, yes. But we should have got game not found or game found if it was called in the first place. Tells me something is not up. Searching for game. 1 second, waits 1 second, calls that searching. Searching is never set to true. Searching equals true. Basically, the coroutine stops immediately. Okay, then we can just use synctoy, run that up again. Okay, host that side, join this side, host a public match, search a match, 1 second, wait, look at that. Okay, found a match, joined it up. Now we are getting double calls here for some reason. Now that is odd. That might have something to do with the fact that we are using a yield return, so it gets hung up on this before it checks again for searching. So we could just have another if searching check in here. And that should prevent that doubling up there. I usually prefer to use, not to use wait for seconds, but rather to counter float down. And then, so every frame it calls the while loop, and it's basically a fake update. I guess I could actually show you what that version looks like. It would be float current time equals 1. Then instead of using the yield wait for seconds there, we do a yield return null. And then current time minus equals time dot delta time. And we do that in a if current time is bigger than 0. Then we count down, else we set current time equal to 1 again. And over there we do our search. So basically this happens every single frame now. And only when current time reaches 0, then it'll do a search game. But it gets to check if searching is still valid every single frame rather than getting hung up on a wait for seconds here. So I much prefer that method. Cool. Let's let that compile, sync it up here. Great stuff, load it up there, run this one, host there, joined up. Okay, here we're going to host a public match. Here we are going to search for a match, and we managed to join one. This time we get 1 game joined, and we get 1 match ID returned over here. Cool. We also have this little close button over here just to exit out of the lobby if we wish. So let's also hook that up. Now that our game searching is working, we can do a, let's see, maybe a disconnect, or what did we call it over here? This button here goes to disconnect lobby, which then calls disconnect game on the player. So let's do a public void disconnect lobby. And disconnect lobby, as we see in our diagram over here, is going to call disconnect game on the player. So we have our search match, our begin match, and let's maybe do after the begin match, because this disconnect can work for in-game as well. And once again, we're going to do the same structure where we have our public void disconnect disconnect game. We have our void cmd disconnect game and our void target disconnect game. Okay. Okay, so we're gonna in here call the cmd disconnect game, and then once over here we're gonna call target disconnect game. And actually now as I'm thinking about it, this shouldn't actually be a target. We want to notify all clients that this player has been disconnected to then do some cleanup of, removing any additional prefabs, updating the UI to reflect that correctly. So we're going to make this a RPC. Okay, then we need our attributes once more. Command attribute there. And then we need our client RPC command over there. So we call our CMD calls RPC, and over there we can have like destroying the player UI in the lobby actually, which I believe we have a reference to. We do not have a reference to it at the moment. Okay, we will get to that point. Okay, so we need to tell the matchmaker as well to disconnect that this player has disconnected. So in here, let's do it at the bottom. Let's do a public void player disconnected, or just disconnect, or whatever. Player disconnect is fine. And we want to give it obviously the player. And that would just be called player, and we want to give it the match ID, which is a string, and keeping with convention, keep that as an underscore. Okay, and what we want to do if we disconnect, we want to find the match that this player exists, and we want to remove from that list, and we want to make sure that any of those flags that we set up earlier, public match or in match and match full, those would be updated to reflect the current or the new state of the game. So this player disconnected is meant to be when you disconnect from the lobby, but will also work if you disconnect during a game as well, since those flags will be updated appropriately. Okay, so we need to do a for loop, and we're going to be looping through matches.count. We're going to go if matches I dot match ID equals our underscore match ID, then we have now found a matching match. We want to maybe get the player index, and that's going to equal matches I dot players dot index of, and it's going to be player dot game object, and that'll give us the player index then, so that we can then remove that exact player by going players dot remove at, and we're going to remove at player index. Then let's just maybe log out here that the player was disconnected from match, and let's just give it the match ID. If you haven't seen this method of logging out, if you just put a $sign before, then you can reference any variables within curly braces directly in that line. Makes it much easier than doing like the plus method or that other comma method as well. This is just neater in my opinion. Okay, let's also maybe log out how many players are remaining, since that would be useful information. And that would be matches I dot players dot count players remaining. so that if there are only 0 players remaining, then we can do something with that. Okay, so then the next step would be to check that. So if matches I dot players, dot count is 0, then we want to say, or let's just do a log over here and say that there are no more players in match, and let's say terminating, and then let's give it the match ID. Cool. Then on the next line, we need to say matches dot remove, and removing at I. So we're removing this exact match. We also need to do the same for match IDs. Remember that we have 2 sync lists over here, one for the actual match data and one for match IDs, so that it's easy enough to say if match IDs contains this match ID, then let's do something with that instead of having to loop through that and comparing every single match ID. Cool. Then we need to go match IDs dot remove, and what we're going to remove is simply match ID. So it'll go, the remove will look for the matching string and remove that element from that list there. Okay, if we've done all that, we found one, then we just need to break out of this just so that we're not repeating or we're not going through the list when it's been modified already. So there is always a danger if you are doing looping through things and then removing from that exact list or collection, then you'll run into errors and you'll often need to do a reverse for loop. So I minus minus, yeah, but you can Google that. I think that does it for our player disconnected function. So in our command over here, before we call the RPC, let's do matchmaker.instance.player disconnected, and let's give it this player, and let's give it our match ID, which is a sync var, and at this point in time, that sync var should be exactly right. Unless somehow you disconnect from the game in a single frame as you connect, then that might give you errors. But yeah, this should work just fine. Okay, so we disconnect from the match then. We call the RPC. The other thing to do is to call to change the network match checker. .id, match ID, equals, and over here we're going to do string.empty to GUID. So we're actually just going to convert an empty string into a GUID and pop that into the match checker. So it just brings it back out. So everyone that disconnects will be able to have that exact same match ID. So all good. Okay, in our RPC disconnect, over here we're going to need to destroy our player UI, which we don't have a reference to currently. So let's see, where can we pop that reference in? So on the start, oh, right here, okay. So we are getting the spawn player UI prefab over here. Let's just create a reference for it, and then we can just remove it or destroy it when we need to. So make it a game object, and let's call it player UI. Yes, okay. And call it, oh, let's maybe change that to player lobby UI. That makes a little more sense. Okay, so here the spawn prefab. We can make spawn prefab instead of a void. Let's make it a game object. And then we can say return the new UI player. So that over here we assign our local reference according to what the UI lobby has spawned. That way, down over here, we can say player lobby UI destroy player lobby UI, and it is a game object. Great. Maybe let's just add in a if player lobby UI does not equal null, just so that there isn't any mistake that it does exist, and then try to destroy it. So remember that this is the player lobby UI for if you are not a local player. So when somebody else joins your lobby, then that's the UI that pops up, and that's why we need to make that a client RPC, so that on all representations of your player, your UI gets destroyed, because that's not a networked object. So we need to manually destroy it like that. Okay, so that will get rid of that little player UI when we disconnect. In our disconnect lobby here, we need to go player.localplayer.disconnect game. And that should disconnect us from the lobby. Just checking my notes here quick. Okay, likewise over here, we will need to destroy the local one if we do disconnect from the game as well. We go back to the search screen. So we're going to need a game object for player lobby UI. And then when we do create the lobby UI from here or from here, just say like so. So it uses the same exact method over there. We just assign the game object according to this local player UI that gets spawned there. Now, when we do disconnect from the game, we can say if the lobby UI does not equal null, then let's call the destroy lobby UI story. There we go. So we destroy that object then. Then we disconnect from the game, and any UI changes now. So we need to maybe set the lobby canvas enabled to false, so that we're no longer in the lobby. Then we probably need to turn our interactables back on as well. And the only other thing is our begin game button. That there's a bug that obviously it gets turned on if you host a game, but it doesn't get turned off when you join in a game. So we need to actually just make sure that that is disabled. So that's the begin game button dot, and we're going to do set active false. And we're actually going to set that false for when we join a game as well. So if we manage to successfully join a game, let's just set that to false. So only the host will be able to turn that button on, and a client will not. Okay. I think that does it for that. Let's test it out. We need to hook up our disconnect button on the lobby scene. So go to the searching, cancel search is fine. In the lobby, it's the cancel match button here. And that will be disconnect lobby. Okay, so that should remove us from the lobby. And let's just sync that up. Load that in there. Go back to the offline scene. Run that. Run that. Host joins. Cool. Okay, so now let's host a public match. Search. We should join that match. Great. If we leave that match, we got player disconnected from match. 1 player is remaining. Good stuff. If we search again, we can join. Okay, so now we have a bug there where the first player's lobby UI did not get destroyed. So let me just find that. So when we join a new game or when we host a new game, we're creating a new UI every time. So let's also just copy this line over here. So before we spawn it, check if there's an existing one and just destroy it. So that way the new spawned one will have the most accurate information as well. and we need to sync that. Can run that one there. Host joins, cool. Host public, search for game, joins game, 1, 2, disconnects, searches for game, and we connect again, and we're still getting the same problem here. Okay. Alright, I think I know what the problem is. Basically, when we call disconnect on the player over here, we are then calling the RPC, and what's happening is it's not even getting to this point because we're already setting the match ID to a different ID, so it's not getting to update this on everyone else's client. So the way we can get around that is, let's add in over here. First of all, let's change our start to a, we're going to do public override void on start client, and then we're going to do a public override void on stop client, and we're also going to do a public override void on stop server. Okay, so the onStart client obviously starts on the client before start is called. This is on the Mirror documentation you can see on their website. So basically all of this, apart from the network match checker, that can actually, I mean, that's just a network check there. So this function, just to make sure it does immediately start, we can call that in awake rather, because it's a local variable check there. Then in our onStart client, this happens before the start method as the client begins or connects to a server. This is called on that client itself, and called on all clients in which this player is represented. So we still do the is local player check, and if it's not, so this is a different player connecting to your lobby, then spawn that prefab. Then if we stop the client, so this happens on the client side and this happens on the server side here. So if a player disconnects, then we want to do something over here, and if a player disconnects on the server side, we also want to do something. So basically, we want to call this and we want to call this from those two functions. So we can't just simply call a CMD when we're ready on the server. So we're just going to separate that out into a void server disconnect, and we're just going to move all of that into there and then just call it over here. And then same thing goes for the client side. We're going to do a void client disconnect, and we're going to move that into that function, and we're going to do a client disconnect call right there. So now server disconnect and client disconnect, we're going to pop in here at the top, obviously server going down to server over there, and the onStop client happening over there. Okay, so when the client stops, client disconnect will be called, and onStop server disconnect will be called. This is now being called as soon as the client is started up. Okay, so that should fix that issue there. Maybe let's just add in some logs over here to just say the client stopped on server and client stopped on, or just client stopped, I guess. Yeah, that should do just fine. And maybe let's just add another login for good measure over here, just so we know exactly what's happening in our code for spawning other player UI. This way we can see if this happens more than once, we know that there's an issue somewhere. Okay, go through to SyncToy, run that, start that one up, start that one up, host. Okay, we're going to do a public match. Okay, and now we're only getting one, so it seems that that fixed that issue. We got one player, two players, one player, two players. If we remove that, Okay, so it didn't update on the server side, but if we search again, we have 1, 2. If we kill that off, the player did disconnect. Okay, so this might be an issue with the server client being the same thing. So let's test that by doing a proper build. Just want to make sure I'm in the right folder. Yeah. Okay, so we do a server build and a client build, real quick to build, and then it's easier just to determine that it's working or not. Right, so that build took a little bit longer than usual, but that's because I upgraded to 2019.4 now, the LTS version. So the next build should be a lot faster, but I'll just pause it if it does take too long anyways. Okay, that build did take much faster. Okay, so let's launch 2 of these over here. Okay, we have our dedicated server running over there. We can see there aren't any errors showing up. We know it's the server build. All good. Great. So we can host a public match over here. And let's do a search. We get player 1, player 2. If we disconnect, that is updated accurately. And we do a search. We connect player 1 and player 2 once more. Let's run a third guy over here and simply call search immediately. And now we get, awesome, player 3 has joined the fray. And if we disconnect there, player 3 has now disconnected. And let's test also the private match. So if we do a host private match and we click search, we should find absolutely nothing here. Not found, not found, not found, not found. Great stuff. And if we then host a public match over here, and the search then kicks into gear, and we find a public match immediately. Likewise, let's test as well the fact that we have this private match over here, and let's double check. So this cannot search over here, and we're doing OCD, and we're joining that match particularly based on the code. So private match, and yes, it is connecting, and this guy is not being able to search it. So seems that everything is working. Okay, well then I guess that concludes this tutorial of automatic matchmaking, which was requested by you guys and really wasn't too difficult to implement once our base functionality was in there. A little bit of bug fixing here and there, but all good. One thing, the repo is totally available. I will link it in the description again, as well as my awesome little flowchart. I find that these really help in understanding how everything should flow, especially when you're going from the view to the model to the controller and back and forth, etc. So especially also just understanding or mentally imaging, structuring how the client data and the server data interacts as well, and how your client data is then represented on other clients as well. So this is Miro. It's a free program. You can have up to 5 boards, I think it is, for free, and unlimited team members. So I actually just have one board that I do all my personal projects on, because it's an endless whiteboard basically, and it's fantastic. You should use it. Yeah, please let me know if there's any other tutorials you wish for me to do. I believe there is one. Somebody asked about doing the work through, or the using AWS for all of this as well. So then building a Linux build and uploading it to your AWS server and all the stuff that goes with that. So I might do that. Cool. See ya.